Welcome to our Spring Boot tutorial series from Trending Venkat Official. In this video, we'll be introducing you to the Spring Boot framework and its features. Spring Boot is a popular Java-based framework that makes it easy to create microservices, web applications, and standalone applications. Whether you're new to Spring or an experienced developer, this tutorial will provide you with the knowledge you need to get started with Spring Boot. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and let's dive into the world of Spring Boot. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is a Java-based framework used to create microservices, web applications, and standalone applications. It is built on top of the Spring framework and provides a simplified way to configure and run applications. What are the benefits of using Spring Boot? Spring Boot provides a number of benefits, including automatic configuration. Spring Boot automatically configures your application based on the dependencies you have added. Embedded servers. Spring Boot comes with embedded servers, such as Tomcat and Jetty, which makes it easy to run your application. Actuator. Spring Boot includes an actuator that allows you to monitor and manage your application. Starter POMs. Spring Boot provides a number of starter POMs that make it easy to add common dependencies to your application. How do you create a new Spring Boot application? There are a few ways to create a new Spring Boot application, including using the Spring Initializer website to generate a project with the dependencies you need, using the Spring Boot CLI to create a new application, using an IDE with Spring Boot support, such as Spring Tool Suite or IntelliJ IDEA. What is the Spring Boot Actuator? The Spring Boot Actuator is a set of tools that allows you to monitor and manage your application. It provides a number of endpoints, such as health and metrics, that allow you to check the health of your application and view metrics about its performance. What is the difference between Spring Boot and the Spring Framework? Spring Boot is built on top of the Spring Framework and provides a simplified way to configure and run Spring-based applications. It includes a number of features, such as automatic configuration and embedded servers, that are not included in the Spring Framework. How do you configure a Spring Boot application? There are a few ways to configure a Spring Boot application, including using application prop, using application properties or application.yml files to configure application level settings, using the addValue annotation to inject property values into your beans, using the Environment API to access property values programmatically. How do you add a dependency to a Spring Boot application? You can add a dependency to a Spring Boot application by editing the pom.xml file and adding the dependency to the less than dependencies greater than section. You can also use the Spring Initializer website to generate a project with the dependencies you need. How do you run a Spring Boot application? You can run a Spring Boot application by using the Spring Boot CLI, by running the application's main class, or by building a jar file and running it. How do you create a RESTful web service with Spring Boot? You can create a RESTful web service with Spring Boot by creating a Spring Boot application and adding the Spring Web and Spring Data REST dependencies. You can then use the @REST controller annotation to create a controller class that handles HTTP requests and returns JSON responses. How do you use a database with a Spring Boot application? You can use a database with a Spring Boot application by adding the Spring Data JPA dependency and configuring your data source in the application properties file. You can then use the Spring Data JPA repository interface to interact with your database. What is the difference between a component, a service, and a repository annotations in Spring Boot? A component is a general-purpose stereotype annotation. A service and a repository are specializations of a component for more specific use cases, such. What is the Spring Boot CLI and how is it used? The Spring Boot CLI is a command-line tool that can be used to run Spring Boot applications. It provides a way to quickly start a new application, run the application, and test the application without having to create a new project or manually configure dependencies. How does Spring Boot handle security? Spring Boot provides a number of options for securing your application. By default, it automatically configures basic security for web applications, but it can also be configured to use more advanced security features such as OAuth 2 and JWT. How can I change the embedded server in a Spring Boot application? You can change the embedded server in a Spring Boot application by adding the appropriate dependency for the server you want to use. For example, to use Jetty as the embedded server, you would add the Spring Boot Starter Jetty dependency to your POM.xml file. How can I create a Spring Boot application that can be run as a jar or WAR file? You can create a Spring Boot application that can be run as a jar or WAR file by including the Spring Boot Maven plugin in your POM.xml file. This plugin allows you to build your application as a jar or WAR file, which can then be deployed to a server. How can I configure logging in a Spring Boot application? You can configure logging in a Spring Boot application by adding a logging configuration file, such as logback.xml or log4j2.xml, to the class path. Spring Boot will automatically detect and use the configuration file. You can also use the application properties file to configure logging settings. How can I create a custom endpoint in a Spring Boot application? You can create a custom endpoint in a Spring Boot application by creating a new controller class and annotating it with the @endpoint and @read operation or @write operation annotations. How can I test a Spring Boot application? You can test a Spring Boot application by using Junit in the Spring Test framework. You can also use the Spring Boot test module to write integration tests for your application. How can I use a different environment for my Spring Boot application? You can use a different environment for your Spring Boot application by creating a new application properties or application environment properties file and specifying the environment when you run your application. How can I enable HTTPS for my Spring Boot application? You can enable HTTPS for your Spring Boot application by configuring SSL TLS in your application server or by using a reverse proxy in front of your application. You can also use the Spring Boot Starter Tomcat SSL dependency to enable HTTPS for the embedded Tomcat server. How can I use Spring Boot with a NoSQL database? You can use Spring Boot with a NoSQL database by adding the appropriate Spring Data module for the NoSQL database you are using. For example, you can use Spring Data MongoDB for MongoDB, Spring Data Cassandra for Cassandra, and Spring Data Redis for Redis.
How can I use Spring Boot with a message broker? You can use Spring Boot with a message broker by adding the appropriate Spring integration module for the message broker you are using. For example, you can use Spring Integration Kafka for Kafka, Spring Integration JMS for JMS, and Spring Integration AMQP for AMQP. How can I use Spring Boot with a caching system? You can use Spring Boot with a caching system by adding the Spring Data Redis or Spring Cache module and configuring the appropriate cache provider for your application. For example, you can use Spring Cache with Cache, Hazelcast, or Caffeine. How can I use Spring Boot with a search engine? You can use Spring Boot with a search engine by adding the Spring Data Elasticsearch module and configuring the appropriate search engine client for your application. How can I use Spring Boot with a stream processing engine? You can use Spring Boot with a stream processing engine by adding the Spring Cloud Stream module and configuring the appropriate binding for your application. For example, you can use Spring Cloud Stream with Apache Kafka or RabbitMQ. How can I use Spring Boot with a cloud platform? You can use Spring Boot with a cloud platform by adding the Spring Cloud module and configuring the appropriate cloud connector for your application. For example, you can use Spring Cloud with AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. How can I use Spring Boot with a service registry? You can use Spring Boot with a service registry by adding the Spring Cloud Netflix Eureka module or the Spring Cloud Console module and configuring the appropriate service registry client for your application. How can I use Spring Boot with a service gateway? You can use Spring Boot with a service gateway by adding the Spring Cloud Netflix Zool or the Spring Cloud Gateway module and configuring the appropriate service gateway for your application.